That afternoon, deep beneath the Caribbean Sea, a submarine was moving through the darkness. No one on board knew for certain if the world outside was still at peace or if World War III had already begun. It was the Soviet Navy's B-59, quietly entering the waters around Cuba during days as tight as a violin string, right in the middle of the missile crisis. Around it lay an invisible siege. On the surface, American destroyers and sub-hunters swarmed. Sonar pings sounded constantly. They dropped small depth charges following their so-called signaling rules. But down in the deep, inside the steel hull of the B-59, every dull thud against the side wasn't just a signal. It felt like a direct punch to the chests of nearly 100 trapped men. The ship shook. Bolts screamed. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Inside the cramped, windowless compartments, the temperature had soared past 40 degrees Celsius. There was no wind, only dim, yellowed lights and the thick smell of engine oil, metal, and stagnant sweat. Sailors were shirtless, their backs drenched. Every breath was heavier and faster than just hours before. The gas analyzer on the wall clicked, its needle slowly creeping into the red zone, warning of rising carbon dioxide and fading oxygen. Young soldiers, eyes dark from sleepless nights, leaned against the bulkheads, closing their eyes to fight for each difficult breath. Some collapsed from dizziness onto the hot floor. Comrades quickly pulled them aside, fanning them with crumpled caps. Everyone was trained to endure hardship, but the same unspoken question began to appear in their eyes. Are we going to die here? The sound of depth charges returned. A deep, heavy thud followed, shaking the hull from bow to stern. To the officers on the U.S. destroyer, it was just a math problem involving pressure. Drop a few more, and the Soviet ship would be forced to surface. But for the crew of the B-59, cut off for days and forced deep, no one told them this was just a surfacing drill. From their perspective, the American fleet was launching a real attack. In the dimly lit command room, a map of the waters around Cuba was spread across the table, covered in blue and red pencil marks tracking U.S. and Soviet positions. The captain, his face gray from fatigue and heat, stared at the map, then looked up at the vibrating steel ceiling. News from Moscow had been cut off long ago. The antenna caught nothing. No one knew if tense peace talks were happening above or if missiles had already left their silos. If nuclear war had begun, then dying silently at the bottom of the sea without fighting back was, to him, unacceptable. In the corner, the political officer clenched his jaw, thinking of national honor, thinking of the U.S. fleet using depth charges to teach them a lesson right on Cuba's doorstep. In a space filled only with machine noise and heavy breathing, the feeling of being backed into a corner became clearer by the second. And then, on that steel table, a choice was spoken in a voice hoarse from heat and lack of oxygen. Use the B-59's last ace in the hole. A nuclear-tipped torpedo. Just launching it into the middle of the U.S. formation on the surface would send a pillar of fire rising from the bottom of the Caribbean, and from there, a chain reaction of retaliation could sweep the entire planet into the apocalypse. But on the B-59, to launch a nuclear torpedo, the will of the captain and the political officer was not enough. Regulations required one more consent. From a quiet senior officer standing by the sweat-stained map, the flotilla commander, Vasili Arkhipov. He had the power to nod or to say no. Amidst the exploding depth charges, amidst the gasping breaths inside a submarine hot as a furnace, that man was about to make a decision whose consequences even he could not fully imagine. Deciding whether World War III would begin from a single shot of this submarine or not. To understand why a small submarine like the B-59 could hold the fate of the entire planet in its hands, we must step back a few weeks before that suffocating moment. the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. At that time, from Moscow to Washington, everyone understood one thing. A single wrong decision could turn the world to ash within hours. The United States had deployed medium-range nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, with a flight time to Moscow of only minutes. In the eyes of the Soviet Union, this was a knife held directly against their throat, threatening their capital and command centers. To retaliate, Nikita Khrushchev chose a bold move, secretly shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, an island right in America's backyard. Convoys of ships carrying launchers, missiles, equipment, and experts were disguised, docking at night and moving deep inland. On paper, the plan was perfect. Complete the deployment before the U.S. found out, creating a balance of deterrence. You have a knife to my throat, so I will put a knife to yours. But the U.S. discovered it sooner than expected. U-2 reconnaissance planes flying high over Cuba captured black and white photos where intelligence officers clearly saw the shadows of launchers, trailers, and warehouses. Red circles on maps in the White House began to expand, encompassing every major American city. From that moment, the countdown clock for a nuclear war began to tick. Washington reacted immediately. Instead of bombing Cuba right away, President John F. Kennedy announced a quarantine, essentially a naval blockade. The U.S. fleet formed an arc of warships, aircraft carriers, and patrol planes around Cuba, intercepting Soviet ships, inspecting them, and forcing them to turn back if necessary. The whole world held its breath, watching as if witnessing two men pointing guns at each other, fingers already on the triggers, waiting to see whose hand would shake first. While on the surface there were speeches, diplomatic telegrams, and tense meetings. Beneath the sea, the Soviet Union played a silent card. A group of diesel-electric submarines, including the B-59, was ordered to enter the waters around Cuba. Their official mission, protect transport ships and Soviet interests. Their actual mission, to become the ultimate deterrent force if everything fell apart. Unlike modern nuclear submarines that can stay submerged for months, the B-59 belonged to the diesel-electric generation. It carried large batteries to run while deep underwater, but these batteries had to be recharged by diesel engines on the surface, where there was air. To stay hidden and survive, the ship was forced to play an extremely dangerous game, diving deep to hide from sonar, then occasionally surfacing or running at periscope depth to recharge electricity and oxygen. As the blockade tightened, every time the B-59 surfaced, it risked detection by U.S. destroyers, anti-submarine helicopters, and sonar. But if they tried to stay submerged forever, the temperature inside the hull would skyrocket, oxygen would drop, and carbon dioxide would build up. The human body would be the first thing to break down. It wasn't just a tactical problem, but a survival problem counted by the hour. Choose to be seen by the enemy, or choose to suffocate yourself. Another invisible enemy was information. Whenever the ship dove deep, the communication antenna was nearly useless. The B-59 departed amidst high tension, then sank into the warm Caribbean waters, far from communication stations. Signals from Moscow weakened and then went silent. For the crew, the world above seemed muted. No one knew if leaders had shaken hands, or if missiles had left their pads and bombers had taken off. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Pentagon drafted signaling rules for Soviet submarines. Use small practice depth charges, detonating at a distance calculated as safe, as a signal to force the sub to surface. On paper, these bombs were described in dry technical language. But those words didn't reach the men sweating inside the hull of the B-59. To them, every loud boom against the side of the ship was a single message: they are attacking us. When those explosions repeated over and over, Amidst the stifling heat and increasingly short breaths, the feeling of being hunted became so real that no one believed the word warning anymore. In the minds of many, it was very possible that up there, World War III had already broken out, and they were just the last ones being hunted down. Making the situation exponentially more dangerous was what the B-59 carried in its launch tube. Not just a standard torpedo, but a torpedo with a nuclear warhead. On a strategic map, it was just a small symbol. In reality, if fired into the middle of the U.S. warship formation off Cuba, that explosion could be interpreted as the opening nuclear attack. From there, the rest would belong to intercontinental ballistic missiles, not just a few depth charges under the sea. Most sailors on the B-59 never saw that weapon with their own eyes. They only knew of it through rumors and orders from above. But the senior officers understood very well. They knew that the special torpedo was not to be used in every encounter, but was reserved for the ultimate scenario. If nuclear war had erupted, if they had no way out, then at least they would drag the enemy down into the abyss with them. Among those who understood best was an officer of average build, with an expressionless face, easily lost in a crowd, but with a file thick with experiences few possessed, Vasili Arkhipov. He was not the captain of the B-59, but the flotilla commander of the submarines operating in the area, sent aboard as a representative of higher command. In every major decision regarding special weapons, Arkhipov had an equal say, perhaps even higher than the man holding the ship's wheel. Before setting foot on the B-59, Arkhipov had survived another hell, the accident on the nuclear submarine K-19, where the reactor malfunctioned, radiation leaked, and a team of engineers had to risk their lives entering the reactor room to fix the fault. Many of them never returned. For Arkhipov, the word nuclear was no longer a strategic concept on paper. It was the smell of antiseptic, the pale faces of friends, and the deaths that lingered for months after the incident was fixed. And that very man, with memories of K-19, with his special position on the ship, was now standing inside a steel hull hot as a heater, surrounded by American ships overhead, with depth charges knocking constantly on the ribs of the sub. Behind him lay the pressure of military orders and national honor. In front of him, on the map and in the launch tube, was a nuclear torpedo that could burn the whole world if fired from this very oxygen-starved ship. The following hours on the B-59 were no longer measured by the hands of a clock. Time was felt only by the heavy pounding of hearts against rib cages, by the number of dry swallows in parched throats, and by every wave of depth charges detonating from the black water outside, hammering against the steel hull. In the living quarters, the air was so thick that every breath felt like drinking a cup of hot water mixed with oil and sweat. The temperature had climbed to over 45 degrees Celsius. Steam rose from human skin like a thin mist. Clothes were soaked, then dried by body heat, then soaked again, clinging tightly to backs and chests. Sailors lay scattered across bunks and on the floor. Some wore only shorts while others draped their shirts over pipes, hoping to wick away a little moisture. The concepts of clean or dirty no longer existed. There was only one shared smell, the pungent odor of human bodies trapped for too long. In the center of the compartment, the old gas analyzer hung like a clock on a hospital wall. Every time the red needle ticked a little further into the danger zone, the ship's doctor would glance at it, then look at the faces of the soldiers who were breathing heavily. Just standing up for a moment caused dizziness. Eyes would go dark. Hearts would race. These were the classic signs of carbon dioxide poisoning. A young sailor, rising to get water, stumbled, his shoulder hitting the bulkhead before he slid to the floor. His comrades rushed to pull him aside, tilting his head to help him breathe, fanning him frantically with a crumpled notebook.
I see it.
Every time the American destroyers on the surface decided to knock, the entire submarine felt like it was being squeezed by a giant hand. The sound of a depth charge dropping was a vague thud, followed seconds later by a deep, resonant boom that spread through the entire hull. Metal vibrated in response. Stainless steel cups, spoons, and tools swayed and clattered against each other. The ceiling lights flickered. Those who had managed to doze off for a few minutes would wake with a start, eyes staring wide in the sickly yellow light. In the command room, the atmosphere was no better. Electronic equipment emitted a cold, blue glow, reflecting in eyes rimmed with dark circles. Sweat dripped onto the map spread across the table, soaking into the pencil lines marking the U.S. ships surrounding the area. Captain Savitsky leaned his hands on the edge of the table, his shoulders stiff. Every explosion outside was a reminder he was sitting in a steel coffin, not a submarine. News from Moscow had gone completely silent. The radio antenna reached up to the surface in vain. Familiar frequencies were now filled only with static, hissing noise and the sound of waves. The communications officer turned the knobs one by one, scanning every band, then shook his head. No new orders, no updates on the situation above. Maybe they were still negotiating, or maybe the missiles had already left their silos and everything had been wiped out. At this depth, no one knew. In the corner of the room, the political officer, the man responsible for the crew's political morale, didn't say much, but his eyes were filled with tension. He looked at Savitsky, then at the map, then up at the ceiling where the depth charges occasionally thundered down. In his head, perhaps, echoed slogans and lessons about not letting the Soviet Union be humiliated, about responding appropriately. But between the ideology and the explosions outside, there was only sweat, the sound of labored breathing, and the pale faces of the very men he was supposed to protect. Vasili Arkhipov usually stood slightly back, one hand lightly gripping a rail for balance. He spoke little, but observed everything. On his face, there were no emotional outbursts like Savitsky's, nor the stubborn frown of the political officer. In him lay a very different kind of fatigue, the fatigue of a man who had seen a nuclear accident from a few meters away, who had stood in the radioactive air of the K-19, not knowing if he would live to see the next year. With every depth charge explosion, Arkhipov would close his eyes briefly, as if analyzing the distance through the vibration. He knew they were small charges. He knew the Americans might be using their signaling language, but he also knew that the people around him couldn't see that subtle distinction. They only heard bombs. In this hot, humid oven with low oxygen, the human brain could no longer clearly distinguish between warning and attack. A quick conversation took place among the duty officers. If they kept diving deep like this in just a few hours, many would no longer be alert enough to perform their duties. Batteries were draining. The systems needed recharging. The theory was clear. They had to get close to the surface, at least to periscope depth, to run the diesel engines. But out there, American sonar was hunting like a pack of sharks smelling blood. Savitsky listened to the report, then remained silent for a long time. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple, paused at his chin, and then fell onto the map. He understood the choice he had: surface and face the U.S. ships, possibly be forced to stop, be interrogated, be humiliated, or continue to dive, accepting the sight of his sailors slowly suffocating on the floor. In a normal place, without war, this might be a purely technical problem. But here, every option carried the shadow of the words disgrace and death. Years of training had taught Savitsky that the enemy is never merciful. The sound of depth charges out there didn't seem like a game to him. It felt like the slow opening act of an execution. In a moment of frustration, he slammed his hand down on the steel table, making the compass and ruler jump. His voice was hoarse. They want to force us up like cowards. If war has broken out up there, they will blast us to pieces the moment we show ourselves. The political officer, torn between the fear of death and the obsession with honor, blurted out in agreement. We cannot let the Soviet fleet be made a laughingstock. If it is war, we must fight back. Those sentences, if spoken in a cool hall on shore, might have been applauded. But here, amidst the droning of ventilators, they only made the air thicker. In the forward compartment where the torpedo launch system was located, the soldiers in charge of the weapons bay also heard snatches of sentences from the command room over the intercom. They looked at each other, saying nothing, but their eyes met with a common question. Are they about to use it? It here didn't need a name. Everyone knew the ship carried a special torpedo, something no one wanted, but everyone understood its meaning. Arkhipov felt very clearly that the ship was drifting toward another dangerous threshold, one no longer measured by meters of depth or percentage of oxygen, but by the psychological state of the commanders themselves. When a human being is trapped in heat, sleep-deprived, surrounded by bombs, cut off from information, the concept of rationality becomes distorted. Fighting back to avoid dying in disgrace suddenly becomes easier to accept than waiting longer to understand the situation. In a rare silence between two waves of bombs, Arkhipov stepped closer to the chart table. He didn't pat anyone on the shoulder. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke in a deep, steady tone. We do not yet know if there is a nuclear war up there or not. The sentence was short, but it fell into the hot, electrically charged void. Savitsky turned to look at him, his eyes tired but still burning with fire. Do you hear what they are doing to us? They are bombing us, Vasili. Arkhipov didn't answer immediately. He let another depth charge explode outside, the hull shaking again, objects shifting again. Then he said, I hear it, but I also remember that up there we have not been ordered to use nuclear weapons. No orders, no evidence saying that missiles have flown. But at that very moment another image appeared in his mind. Dark skies, the deck of the K-19, his brother officers standing in flimsy protective suits, walking into the radiation zone to patch the reactor. They had followed orders, they had sacrificed, and many died in silence, their names known to no one. An argument at the end of the compartment pulled everyone back to reality. Two young sailors were debating whether missiles on shore had been launched or not. One said, I'm sure they've fired already. Otherwise, why would the Americans be so aggressive? The other, eyes red from lack of sleep, replied, if they fired, there probably isn't a Cuba left. No one left for us to protect. These were crude versions of the more sophisticated argument taking place in the command room. The ship shook again. An object fell from a shelf to the floor with a piercing clang. Savitsky looked at Arkhipov, then at the political officer, then at the map with its circles symbolizing the range of the U.S. ships. In his mind, the question, to surface or not to surface, had begun to deform. It was no longer just life or death, but became how to die in silence, or die in a nuclear explosion that would be heard all the way to Washington. At the end of the deck section, an older sailor who had spent many years at sea muttered to no one in particular, real war sometimes isn't when the guns go off, but when people think the guns have already gone off. That sentence, if written in a strategic report, would surely be italicized. But here, it dissolved into the sound of engines and bombs. In the command room, the air felt thick enough to be cut into slices. Amidst the explosions, the gasping breaths, the memories of K-19, the textbook pages on honor and discipline, the decision to use the special weapon was no longer a hypothesis. It had begun to be spoken into words. Not yet a command, but it had taken shape and form. A young officer in charge of communications, his face gaunt, looked at Arkhipov with eyes that mixed hope and panic, as if asking, "What are we going to do, comrade?" But how could one ask when the answer would decide not only the fate of the dozens of men in this hot hull, but could also drag down the fate of millions who had never heard the name B-59? Somewhere on the surface, the American destroyers continued dropping depth charges according to their signaling procedure. In the campaign logbook, they might write a few dry lines. Increased pressure to force Soviet submarine to surface. They didn't see the sweat-drenched faces. They didn't hear the hoarse arguments about honor and nuclear orders. They certainly didn't know that just a few steps from the command table. In a sealed tube, a nuclear torpedo lay waiting, needing only 3 words, "I agree," to turn the Caribbean into a giant radioactive wound. When a bomb louder than usual shook the entire hull, Savitsky instinctively gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He turned toward the political officer, then glanced at Arkhipov. In that moment, no one needed to speak aloud. Everyone in the room understood. The question was no longer, will we use nuclear weapons, but when will that order be spoken? And it was at that suffocating point where heat, bombs, lack of oxygen, and fear blended into a toxic cocktail, that the B-59 drifted toward the boundary between a dangerous incident and a true apocalypse. Only one step remained, a step the captain was about to take, and there was only one person capable of pulling him back. In that command room, cramped as a metal coffin, there was a moment where all sound seemed to be compressed into a single point of silence. The engines still hummed their low, rhythmic drone. The ventilation fans still rattled with a wheezing cough. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of a recently exploded depth charge still reverberated. But for the men standing around the chart table, the loudest sound in the world was the beating of their own hearts. Captain Savitsky looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red from exhaustion and smoke. His 2 hands gripped the edge of the steel table so tightly that his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He stared down at the pencil circles on the map, the cold, unfeeling symbols representing the American destroyers, the blockade line, the trap that he felt was closing in on him. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse, escalating into a near animalistic growl. "They are hunting us like beasts. If this isn't war, then what is it? We will not die here like a flock of sheep. We will give them a nuclear strike, something to make the entire American fleet remember us forever." The sentence was like a lit match thrown into a tank of gasoline. A few young officers standing nearby flinched, glancing at each other in terror. Nuclear strike, those 2 words, until now, had only existed in training simulations, in strategic meetings, in dry textbooks. Now, they were spoken aloud in a room so hot it was hard to breathe, amidst the booming of enemy depth charges. It was no longer a hypothesis. The political officer, his face flushed red from the heat and the unbearable tension, clutched a small notebook in his hand. He nodded, his voice trembling but resolute. "The captain is right. We cannot allow ourselves to be dragged to the surface like a fish on a hook. If war has broken out up there, we have a duty to fight back. The Soviet Union never surrenders." Those slogans, memorized by heart from days in political school, now rang out amidst the groaning metal of the submarine's hull. In that space, Every eye slowly turned toward the one man who had remained mostly silent until now, Vasili Arkhipov. He did not carry the appearance of a movie hero. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He didn't shout. He simply leaned forward slightly, one hand gripping the handrail for support, his eyes looking straight at the captain. But from that very position, he held in his hands the only thing that could stop the order that had just been uttered, the power to veto the use of the nuclear torpedo. According to the regulations of the Soviet submarine fleet, to launch that special weapon, the will of the captain and the nod of the political officer were not enough. It required the consent of 3 people: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. In this case, Arkhipov himself.
Soon it will pass.
3 men, 3 signatures, 3 nods. Only then could the door be opened to the nuclear warhead lying dormant in the launch tube at the bow of the ship. Savitsky understood this clearly. After pouring his rage into words, he turned fully toward Arkhipov, breathing heavily, his voice raspy from heat and lack of oxygen. "Vasili, you see it. They are dropping bombs on our heads. We are isolated. We cannot communicate. We don't know what is happening up there. I believe war has already broken out. We must launch. You are the flotilla commander here. Do you support this?" In that moment, all background noise seemed to recede. The others looked at Arkhipov, waiting. In the forward torpedo room, the crew on combat duty had begun to receive vague orders through the internal comm system. Prepare to check the special tube, ensure readiness. Although no one explicitly said nuclear, everyone knew which tube was being discussed. Arkhipov looked at Savitsky for a long time, much longer than usual for a military question. Sweat streamed down his temples, sliding across his cheek before dropping onto his collar. Inside his head, there wasn't just the sound of today's depth charges. There was the alarm siren of the K-19 from years ago, the moans of friends dying from radiation sickness, the heavy footsteps in the submarine corridor as bodies covered in blankets were carried away. He knew that nuclear was not just a large explosion on the surface of the sea. It was the years that followed, when men died slowly in hospitals, when lands were forbidden due to contamination. He took a slow breath, his chest feeling heavy as if crushed by a stone. Then he spoke, his voice not loud but distinct, every word weighing heavily on the deck. "I do not agree. I oppose the launching of the nuclear torpedo in this situation." The sentence fell into the hot void of the room like a piece of cold metal dropped into boiling oil. A young officer standing nearby stammered, thinking he had misheard. The political officer spun around, eyes wide with disbelief. "Comrade Arkhipov, do you understand that we are being attacked? Do you understand they are bombing our heads? In a war situation, he who does not fight back is he who surrenders." Savitsky also froze for a moment. He was used to his orders being executed almost automatically. In his exhausted, volatile state, he saw launching the weapon as the only escape from this humiliating trap. Not because he wanted to destroy the world, but because in the logic of a soldier backed into a corner, dying without firing back was unacceptable. "Why?" he asked, his voice lowering, but becoming more dangerous than before. "Do you think we should lie here waiting for them to bomb holes in our hull? Do you think Moscow will forgive us if we let ourselves be dragged to the surface like prisoners of war? Do you want it written in the war logs that we were afraid?" Arkhipov did not back down. There was fire in his eyes too, but it was a different kind of fire, the fire of restraint pushed to its limit. He replied slowly, but no longer with the softness of before. "I believe we do not have enough information to launch nuclear weapons. We have no orders from command. We do not know if shots have been fired up there. If it is already nuclear war up there, One torpedo from us changes nothing. It only makes everything worse. If they haven't fired up there, then we will be the ones starting World War III. I do not want to be the man who signs that decision." The political officer gritted his teeth. "Are you speaking like a soldier or a philosopher, Comrade Arkhipov? In war, hesitation is death. We are being humiliated. They are dropping bombs around our ship like they are disciplining a dog. Do you want to suffer that?" Arkhipov turned to him, his eyes red, not from anger, but from lack of sleep and oxygen. "I saw comrades sacrifice themselves for the nuclear reactor on K-19. They didn't die because they were cowards. They died because they followed orders in a system that allowed no one to say no. Today, I have the right to say no, and I will use it." Another depth charge exploded outside. The hull shook so violently that cups on the table tipped over, splashing water onto the map. No one wiped it up. The silence following Archipov's words was louder than the explosion itself. Savitsky stepped closer to him, the distance closing to just a few dozen centimeters. Two men, drenched in sweat, stood face to face in the stifling heat. Amidst the sound of engines and heartbeats, "You understand that if we surface, we could be captured, searched, branded as cowards?" the captain asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You understand that we might pay the price later for not fighting back?" "Yes," Arkhipov replied, unblinking. "But if we launch, it won't just be us paying the price. Millions of people up there will pay the price too. Can you bear that cost, Comrade Captain? Are you so sure you are right that you are willing to let the whole world burn along with this ship?" The others in the command room dared not intervene. They felt as if they were standing on a razor's edge between two worlds. On one side was soldierly honor, pride, the feeling of being cornered. On the other side was something more abstract, responsibility to millions of strangers they had never met. The difference between hero and criminal is sometimes just a pen stroke in a report, a line of text in a history book, but here it was also a button press. That moment stretched into infinity. Savitsky looked deep into Archipov's eyes, searching for a sign of fear, a crack to force him to yield. But what he saw was only exhausting fatigue mixed with a determination as hard as steel. Arkhipov didn't want to die. No one on this ship wanted to die. But if forced to choose between death in a scorching submarine hull and the death of an entire world, he chose the first. A dry cough rang out from the corner of the room, making the air slightly less dense. The ship's doctor, who had been standing silently, spoke up softly. "If we stay submerged this deep for a few more hours, many people will fall unconscious. Some may never wake up. Whether we launch or not, we will lose men to oxygen starvation. I am forced to report this." That cold reality, strangely enough, helped pull everyone out of the emotional spiral. War, honor, nukes, all were suddenly placed next to something very concrete. Soldiers collapsing from asphyxiation right on the deck. Savitsky turned to the control panel, where the numbers indicating battery status were dropping. If he continued to dive deep, the ship would soon have no power to move, no power to steer. Arkhipov seized the opportunity, speaking again, his voice still steady but more decisive. "We have another choice. Not dying of suffocation and not launching nukes. We surface. They might point guns at us. They might yell. They might order us to follow. But at least we will not be the ones firing the first shot of World War III. If they haven't fired up there, we will show them that we do not want to be the ones to pull the trigger." Silence held for a few more seconds. Then, as if a taut wire had been stretched to the breaking point but finally didn't snap, Savitsky turned away, slammed his hand against the hull, and roared to the whole room, Fine, prepare to surface. No special weapons launch without direct orders from Moscow. His voice was still full of anger, but the anger had shifted direction from the American fleet to the very dilemma that history had thrown onto his shoulders. The order traveled through the ship like an electric current. In the torpedo room, hands that were trembling while preparing to check the launch tube suddenly relaxed. A young soldier slumped down onto a metal bench, exhaling a long breath as if he hadn't breathed in hours. In the engine room, engineers turned valves, preparing to switch operating modes. The B-59, the ship that had almost become the first shooter of the apocalypse, began to inch upward, like a tired metallic creature crawling out of the darkness. The water column outside the hull thinned. Pressure decreased. A few ears could hear the change through the groaning of the hull plates. Then, after a series of maneuvers, the ship finally broke the surface. Light, even the blindingly harsh light of the Caribbean, pierced through the periscope, then through the hatches, flooding into compartments accustomed to the dirty yellow of light bulbs. Air from the surface rushed in, salty, hot, but infinitely fresher than the stagnant air below. On the water, the American destroyers were waiting. From the B-59, officers looked through the periscope, seeing giant gray hulls, cannons, antennas, flags fluttering in the sun. The distance was close enough for both sides to see human silhouettes through binoculars. On one side were the eyes of American sailors, curious, tense, not knowing what the enemy would do. On this side were the sunken eyes of men who had just descended from a hot hell. No shots were fired, no missiles were launched. Instead, there were commands over loudspeakers, flag signals, and radio conversations in professional, cold voices. In the U.S. Navy's logs, perhaps that day would be recorded as forced Soviet submarine to surface. Situation tense but controlled. There was no box in the report form for almost caused global nuclear war. The B-59, after surfacing, had to accept the humiliation that Savitsky feared most. It was surrounded, shadowed, and forced to leave the area. In the Soviet campaign diary, there might be pages requiring the captain and political officer to explain themselves. But for Vasili Arkhipov, that price was still much cheaper than what could have happened if he had nodded a few minutes earlier.
This projection shows
that night, as the ship moved away from the blockade, the temperature in the compartments dropped. The CO2 meter retreated from the red zone. Soldiers collapsed onto their bunks, sleeping like the dead. In the command room, the lights were softer. No one mentioned the word nuclear anymore. Savitsky looked at Arkhipov less often, but every time their eyes met, between those two men, beyond the sweat and the hours of arguing, there was something else. A vague realization that they had just crossed a boundary that few people in this world ever have to face. Somewhere on land, Kennedy and Khrushchev were still engaged in a battle of wits. Diplomats were still sending long telegrams back and forth. Ordinary people on both sides of the ocean were still going to work, going to the market, taking their children to school, perhaps only hearing radio news about tensions in Cuba. None of them knew that, at a depth of a few dozen meters below the sea, a submarine, hot as a furnace, had almost pulled the trigger for the apocalypse, and a tired man with sunken eyes named Vasili Arkhipov had said no. History, in those years, would not record his name on the front page. Shining medals would be awarded to leaders and generals. The story of the three men in the cramped command room of the B-59, one who wanted to launch, one torn between honor and fear, and one who dared to object, would take decades to be fully revealed. But that is a story for later years. As for that day, right after the decision not to launch the nuclear torpedo, Vasili Arkhipov was just an exhausted naval officer, leaning his back against the red-hot steel hull, breathing deeply the rare sea breeze blowing in through the hatch, and silently hoping that he had done the right thing. Even if no one on Earth knew about the vote against the apocalypse that he had just cast inside an old submarine in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. After that day, the B-59 quietly left the Caribbean waters, turning its bow toward home like an ordinary submarine that had just completed a routine mission. There were no fireworks, no military parades, no eloquent announcements on the radio declaring that nuclear war had been prevented at the bottom of the sea. All the crew brought back was exhaustion, a few dry pages of reports, and a decision that almost no one outside the ship knew about. In the internal review meetings, people were more concerned with why the ship revealed its position, why it let itself be forced to surface by the U.S. fleet, why they weren't tougher. Vasili Arkhipov was not handcuffed, not thrown into prison, but neither was he hailed as a hero, nor awarded a shining medal for saving the world. He continued his career as an ordinary naval officer, aged in silence, and passed away before his name was known to all of humanity. Only decades later, when parts of the files were declassified, did historians, journalists, and the former sailors themselves begin to retell the story. They pieced together fragments of memories, minutes of meetings, and anonymous lines in reports to realize that during the tensest days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a point where the world's moral compass deviated solely due to emotion and lack of information. And at exactly that point, one man said, no. Some Western researchers call Arkhipov the man who saved the world without anyone knowing his name. From then on, people began to use phrases like, a vote against the apocalypse. On the B-59 that day, the captain had one vote, the political officer had one vote, and Arkhipov was the third vote. Had he agreed, history might have branched off into a completely different, darker path. But he did not agree. In a system built to promote obedience and decisiveness, he chose to do the hardest thing: slow down, doubt, and refuse to pull the trigger. Today, the world is different, but the things that make us hold our breath are still there. Ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, false alarms, fake radar warnings, confrontations between warships and armed aircraft. People design countless layers of safety, from launch codes to verification procedures to computer systems. But at the final layer, it is always a human being. Someone, somewhere, in a cramped room, having to decide whether to trust the radar, trust the report, trust their own anger, or not. The lesson from Vasili Arkhipov is not a romantic ballad about one individual changing the world just to sound nice. It is more practical and colder. In moments of insult, of being cornered, of being cut off from information, we are far more likely to accept violence than usual. Courage, sometimes, is not daring to press the button, but daring to endure humiliation, daring to take responsibility for saying, there is not enough data to kill each other yet. And that is why, more than half a century later, when recounting the Cuban Missile Crisis, people do not just talk about Kennedy, Khrushchev, about missiles in Cuba or Turkey. They mention one more name that sounds very ordinary: Vasili Arkhipov, the Soviet naval officer who cast a nay vote in a room hotter than 50 degrees, giving this world another chance to wake up the next morning. And you, if you put yourself in his shoes, amidst depth charges exploding around the hull, amidst the feeling of humiliation, amidst the fear of suffocating with your comrades, would you choose to press the button to die gloriously, or choose to say no and accept being questioned, doubted, and forgotten by history? Tell Death Zone in the comments section. In your opinion, was Vasili Arkhipov a hero, or just a man who was calm at the right time in a world going mad?